Hi, everyone, and welcome to Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series, Season 2. I'm Brian Whittemore, your host for today. Itasca Waters is a nonprofit whose goal is to educate residents in Itasca County about how to keep our water clean for both the environment and the economy. We've been teaming up with like-minded people and organizations for 14 years now, and you can read about those projects on our website at itascawaters.org. If any of that is of interest to you, please consider becoming a member or a volunteer to help support programs like this. And we thank our partners shown on your screen for their support in producing this program. Now, here on this next screen is your guide for today's program. Dr. Amy Schrank will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll answer questions from you. To submit a question, you only need to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in a brief question. You can do this at any time, and we will read the questions on your behalf. We will not be using the chat function today. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website at itascawaters.org. And finally, we value your opinion. So please click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program, or complete the survey that will be sent to you by email. And we thank you much for doing that. Okay, today's presenter is Dr. Amy Schrank, and the title of today's program is Are Invasive Cattails Taking Over Your Lake? Amy is an extension program leader and a fisheries and aquaculture extension educator with University of Minnesota Sea Grant out of Duluth. She'll be talking about how their project aims to understand how we can manage invasive cattail in our lakes to restore nearshore plant community diversity, maintain water quality, benefit fish and other organisms, and keep our lakes healthy. So now here's Dr. Amy Schrank. Amy?
Thanks very much, Brian. And I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. There we go. Are you seeing my slides? Perfect. As Brian said, my name's Amy Schrank. I am an extension program leader at University of Minnesota Sea Grant, and working with me on this project is Dan Larkin, who's a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and I will be talking to you today about cattails, invasive cattails, and whether or not they're taking over your lake. So I want to start out here with an example of what a healthy lake ecosystem should look like in Minnesota. So you can see we have a couple of people in here for scale. What I want you to notice about this photo is the variety of plants you see both in the foreground and in the background. We see lots of different types of plants here. We might see a few cattail here and there. If you look in the background, and you can see my arrow, you see a lot of brown-topped plants. These are bulrushes. Bulrushes are very important in the emergent zone of lakes. So emergent zone being where plants are rooted in the water, under the water, and they emerge into the air. So bulrush is an important emergent plant, and that should be the dominant emergent plant in lake ecosystems. And as we move out a little deeper, you can see, of course, there's floating leaf plants such as lily pads, and you can assume there's submerged plants as well. So the point here is there's lots of different types of plants with lots of different types of physical structure. That's important in nearshore lake ecosystems. We move down to what you might call a frog's eye view. You can see all these plants mixed together with different shapes. We have bulrushes. We also have floating leaf plants. And then further from a fish's perspective, these species work quite well for them. You can see minnows are a schooling species. They like to swim together. They need enough space to swim around. And bulrushes have narrow stems that allow fish to move through them. They don't accumulate a lot of dead plant material year to year. So this is ideal for protection from fishes from other fish predators. And then if you look at the other photo, you can see, of course, submergent plants are important. And floating leaf plants would protect fish from things like birds and other predators coming from above. So the point here is it's the variety and what we call heterogeneity, so different types of plant growth forms that are really important in a nearshore lake ecosystem. As I'm sure you know, these nearshore systems are very important spawning and nursery areas for fishes of all types, even the game fishes that we care about. You can see the northern pike down here in the corner. In fact, most fish in a lake spend at least some of their time in a nearshore sort of vegetated area, whether they're spawning, they might be growing up as larvae, or cruising the edge of the shore to feed. Most fish use it at some point in their life. Small-bodied species such as minnows spend their entire lives in these vegetated zones. People often don't think too much about minnows unless they're using them for bait, but actually minnow species compose the largest part of diet for game fishes. So these small fishes are really important food for the larger game species that humans tend to think are more important. So what is happening lately with cattail on our nearshore lake zones? So they are changing from sort of those initial pictures you saw, very heterogeneous environments, lots of different types of plant species, to something that looks a little bit more homogeneous with cattail dominating these areas. So it's this homogenization of the plant community that can be a problem. So this is actually a picture from Northern Lake Huron, but we see this on lake shores as well. And I want to take a moment here to talk about cattail individually and what types of cattail we have in Minnesota and how this invasive cattail got here. So we do have a native species of cattail, the broadleaf cattail. It's called Typha latifolia, if you care about things like scientific names. So that's been here always. We also have a narrow-leaf cattail, Typha angustifolia, that probably came from Europe sometime in the 1800s. So one question I always get is, how do you tell these species apart? And it's pretty easy if you have both of these parent species. So if you look at our broadleaf cattail, broad leaves, it has a wider leaf. It's not very easy to tell that it has a wider leaf unless you're actually physically comparing it to a narrow leaf cattail. But you can also look at the male and the female flowering parts of the plant. So the top part, the yellowy part, is the male part, bottom catkin is the female part, and they almost touch in our broadleaf cattail. You can see here in our narrow leaf cattail, there's a really big space. So that seems pretty obvious and pretty easy to tell apart, at least when they're flowering, right? But the problem really occurs when these two species hybridize. So wherever narrowleaf cattail overlaps the range of broadleaf cattail, so whenever they're in close proximity, they will always hybridize. And you end up with the hybrid, and it's the hybrid that's the problem. So they're called hybrid cattail, big shocker, Typha X glauca, which just indicates they're a cross of those two species. Hybrid cattail are harder to tell apart. You can see that these parts of the plant are sometimes close, sometimes further, and sometimes even almost touching. So because you have a lot of what we call back crossing occurring, you have lots of different distances between the male and female parts of the plant, kind of different leaves. But what I generally tell people is that if you have some stems in a huge clone that are sometimes close together and sometimes far apart, you likely have hybrid cattail. Our native cattail doesn't tend to grow and overtake other plants. The reason is broadleaf cattail co-evolved with all the other plant species that it shares space with. So it tends to sort of play nicely with other plants. Hybrid cattail tends to take over. So if it's growing in that overtaking form, it tends to be hybrid cattail. But it can be hard to tell apart. So when did it get here? This is an older map that's from 1999, but the idea is it's showing you the range expansion of Typha X glauca, which is the invasive cattail, hybrid cattail. And if you look here on the eastern seaboard in about 1860, this dark line, that's when they first start seeing the hybrid. They can tell there are extensive herbarium records from these times of sort of early to mid 1800s, but also pollen grains are preserved in the soil and sediment. So people can take a soil core, look at the pollen grains that are there and infer what plants were there at the time. So nobody has seen this hybrid before about 1860. This red star represents Minnesota. So you can see by 1949, we had hybrid cattail here already. And you can see these different slashes of lines indicating it's spreading out further. This map's from 1999. If you look at a 2023 map, it's all across the United States and it continues to spread. So it kind of is a little bit of a sneaky invasive species because it's been here a long time. It's hard to tell apart from our native cattail, and it just sort of slowly marches across our ecosystems. And sometimes you don't notice it till 10 years later, suddenly you have a huge patch of cattail that you didn't realize was encroaching. So it's a problem. The other thing I would say here is that we're not going to get rid of it, right? It's not something we're going to eradicate. It's more of a management situation. So figuring out ways to manage it are important. So what cattail does, I'm going to show you an example here with one old aerial photo and one newer photo. So this is actually an aerial photo of some islands in Rainy Lake near one of our cattail sites called Jackfish Bay. So you can see it's from 1972. The black is water, right? And you can see the islands. These roads were relatively recent, and when they built these roads connecting these islands, they weren't super careful about ensuring that they were preserving water movement, right, among these different islands and around these islands. When you talk to people who lived here a long time, they say, oh yeah, we used to water ski between these islands, it's all clear. But once they built the road, they really changed the flow pattern through this area. So what happened, showing you a photo from 2020, is that hybrid cattail has encroached in all of these places where the water has been more regulated, and now they have really big problems. So all this brown stuff you see here is hybrid cattail in all of these areas. And you can see they're trying to channelize it to try and get rid of it. And they actually are working on a big project to try to remove it in some areas and restore that flow among those islands to get rid of cattail. But it has been invading in a lot of places. So a little bit of the biology or background of cattail. How do they reproduce? I'm sure you've probably seen the wind dispersed seeds from cattail. So that's one way they reproduce. They also reproduce clonally with a rhizome. So a rhizome is just the root you see with that yellow arrow by it. Each stem can shoot out new rhizomes, and they basically clone each other. And this isn't uncommon in wetland plants. Lots of wetland plants reproduce this way. But you can see it's pretty easy for them to just grow out and form these large clones. But why is it that hybrid cattail take over and our native cattail doesn't take over? And people generally attribute this to something called hybrid vigor. Hybrid vigor, the other word you might hear here is heterosis, the idea that the offspring of two parents actually is bigger or does better than either its parents, right? So here's an example of parent one and parent two with ears of corn, and the hybrid between those produces a larger ear of corn. So it's just more fit for its environment. And that seems to be the case with hybrid cattail, which is the usual explanation for why it tends to take over. So hybrid cattail tends to have a more rapid growth rate than either of its parents. It grows to a larger height, and you can see in this photo that the cattail clone is much larger than any of these plants. This is in actually a lake around it, so it grows really a much taller. Larger clones, so just really big, broad stands. More biomass accumulation. So what I mean by biomass is both living and dead plant matter. One of the big problems with cattail is hybrid cattail is it produces a lot of dead plant material, and it just lays there. And in some cases, it actually can make what was once maybe water or an aquatic environment into sort of a terrestrial environment. So that's one of the problems with cattail. It's very tolerant of a wide range of water levels. We really like to manage water, right? Even in our lakes, we always change water levels. And when we do that, it's really beneficial for hybrid cattail. It also prefers nutrient-rich systems. So when we put fertilizer on our lawn or other nutrients in the environment, cattail is happy about that. It tends to take up nutrients really, really quickly and do really well. It's also pretty tolerant of saline conditions. So when we put salt on our roads, that's pretty. It's not terribly harmful for cattail because they're pretty tolerant. So a little bit more about what we're doing. So in the past, other researchers, myself included, have done some work looking at cattail invaded nearshore zones and also uninvaded nearshore zones. And we found some differences. So overall, when cattail invade a nearshore zone, we see reduced dissolved oxygen in the water, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. We see reduced plant diversity, reduced fish abundance, and reduced fish diversity. So abundance being just how many fish there are, and reduced diversity meaning fewer different species of plants and fishes. So it's clear that when cattail invade, it causes problems for some of these areas. So our big question is, how can we manage hybrid cattail to help mitigate these negative effects without harming other non-target species? So what are the ways we manage for cattail? So we use herbicide. DNR does actually spray cattails for herbicide, especially in the prairie pothole region. This is not great around water, right? So one of the almost all studies show that whatever type of herbicide you're using, really has negative effects on especially larval fish and amphibians, which have very, very thin skin. So it's not really a great option for lakes, especially if you're worried about your fish communities. And people also burn it. This can work in a place that's largely uninhabited, but on our lake shores that are highly developed, probably not a great option. There's also some non-target effects of burning. We mow it, right, just above the water. That's an option, although you have to repeatedly do that. And also we can cut it below the water. This also requires repeated application, but has shown some potential. So we're going to talk mostly about that cutting below the water. So this is a photo from some work in Great Lakes coastal wetlands, where these folks found that if they cut cattail below the water, so you're cutting the stem below the water, you're not pulling out the entire root, we can actually see some native plants growing back. So the idea is you open up this cattail and you remove living and dead cattail biomass, right? All that plant material. And the sun gets in there, the seeds are still in the sediment, and native plants can regrow. So we've seen this in the Great Lakes, in some Great Lakes coastal wetlands. The reason this happens, and this is just like science fun fact, I guess, and if I was in the room with all of you, I would bring a cut cattail and pass it around and show it to you. But the reason this works for cattail and would work for other aquatic plants is that inside a cattail stem, there's these holes in the stem called parenchyma. Because the cattail grows under, the roots are underwater where there's no oxygen, they need a way to move oxygen from the top of the plant down to the bottom of the plant. Those roots need oxygen, even though they're living in an anoxic environment. And so parenchyma are the way they do this. Those holes move oxygen down. Other wetland plants do this as well. But once you cut that plant below the water, you're kind of drowning that individual stem, right? Because it no longer is getting oxygen down to the root. One thing that you'll see in a little bit is that if that cut stem actually becomes, stops being submerged or comes out of the water, they can grow a stem back. So water level is really important, but this parenchyma really sort of helps with drowning this individual stem when you cut it. So if we zoom out on lakes in the Midwest and in Minnesota in particular, you can see that we create a lot of these channels, right? Whether by permit or just by chance, trying to get our boats in and out of vegetated areas, clearing spots for us to see into the lake, for places for people to swim. So we are already creating a lot of these openings. Our question is really, when we mechanically harvest in this way, or we create these openings, does this have any positive effect on nearshore plant and fish communities? Because if it does have a positive effect, maybe it's beneficial for us to do some more small-scale harvesting. And the reason small-scale harvesting would be useful is that we all know how expensive it is to remove a wide swath of cattail, or if you don't know how expensive it is expensive. And so if we're sort of spreading the effort among a lot of landowners or a number of people, each of whom is getting a permit and maintaining their own opening, maybe we'll have some ecosystem effects of a large number of relatively small scale openings. So that's kind of our idea for this project. So our specific questions that we're asking, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we found, and then I'll let you ask me some questions. So our overall questions: does cattail removal increase plant diversity and benefit water quality and fish communities in nearshore lake ecosystems? And secondly, how does this vary across region in Minnesota? So for example, does this look different when we're in maybe these northern areas that are where the seed bank is still, seeds are still in the sediment, maybe in southern lakes where it's only cattail, perhaps if you remove cattail, nothing else grows back, and you would be concerned about erosion. So we think there might be a range difference depending on where you are in the state. Another thing to know is that with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, you can acquire aquatic plant management permit to remove a 15-foot wide swath of vegetation from shoreline to open water, cattail included. So the DNR is involved with us in this project, and what they are noticing, this is actually a picture from them, is that in some of these openings, and you can see this is obviously a channel where somebody keeps their boat, and presumably the boat's going in and out, this far big batch of vegetation here is cattail. They're seeing some regrowth of native plants, even though this is being used. So anecdotally, this seems to be happening. So this is the current permit. Our openings were a little bit bigger than this. So just to give you an idea of where we did our study, Our northern lakes were Rainy and Capitogama, and then our southern lakes were Coon and Big Marine. That's as far south as we got during this part of our study. And I just want to show you kind of what we did. What was our sort of experimental design? So I'm showing you an aerial photo from Big Marine Lake. You can see some researchers out here in the distance. This is some drone footage that the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center took for us. And so we went to each lake and we chose 2 sites. One site was a control site where we did not remove cattail, and both of these sites are within cattail stands. And then another site where cattails will be removed. They weren't necessarily as close as this. This is just kind of to show you what it looked like. So 2 sites, one where cattail is retained and one where cattail is removed. And you can see in this little inset, it's just what it looks like over in an overhead view. And we removed cattails from shoreline all the way to open water. So just to kind of give you a sense of time of how this project has proceeded, this is our most recent timeline. In summer of 2021, we chose our 9 lakes and all of our sites, and we went to all of these sites and we measured water quality. So really just temperature and dissolved oxygen, plants and fish before removing cattail at either site. So you can see here, I have cattail retained, cattail removed. Both of these are green. We didn't remove cattail yet. In the fall of 2021, we did remove cattail at 1 of 2 of those plots. And then in summer of 2022, this past summer, we went back to these sites and measured water quality, plants and fish after we removed cattail at one site, because we wanted to compare that before and after cattail removal to see if there were differences. And just a picture to show you what some of these removal sites look like. We did some of them in early fall, some of them in late fall, and you can see this is what it looks like growing up the following summer. I have to give a shout out here to the graduate students who work on this project. It would not get done without the graduate students and their hard work. So this is Brendan Nee writing on his clipboard, and Mike Tuma. Brendan worked on the fishes and Mike worked on the plants. They are frantically crunching their data and getting our final data together as we speak, as they're hoping to graduate this summer. We also had 2 great research technicians. I love these 2 pictures because it was totally different years. You know, Caitlin was in the first year and Dylan worked for us in the second year, but the photo is actually almost identical of what they're doing. So they are 2 students from UMD who helped us with summer research as well. So this crew is really responsible for all the great work from this project. So I'm going to show you 2 data slides here, and I don't want you to be scared of data slides because they're not difficult, but I want to show you what kinds of things we're finding with our study so far, with the caution that, of course, these data are still preliminary. I still have they're still working on their final data. So one thing I wanted to show you that is important is what happens with dissolved oxygen. So dissolved oxygen is just oxygen in the water. It's certainly really important for fish. It's important for other organisms too, all the bugs that live in the water that fish feed on, and frogs and all kinds of stuff. So this graph, and I'm going to walk you through it, has dissolved oxygen on the y-axis, and this is just time. So 8 a.m. to about 1 p.m. here during the day. And I'll show you some dots on there. Orange is cattail removed, so you can see their little picture of our site over there, and blue is cattail retained. So there's our data, and this is data from one lake, so this is from Long Lake. And what you can see is that the orange dots represent the dissolved oxygen at cattail removed sites, and the orange line, and then the blue dots and the kind of gray-blue line represent the dissolved oxygen we measured at cattail retained sites. The point here is we're seeing more oxygen in these sites where cattail have been removed. And I'll show you why we think this is the case. And I think this is an important reason that removal might be beneficial for fishes. So I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on dissolved oxygen. It's not complicated. So when we think about dissolved oxygen in the water in areas where there are plants, we see this general pattern. So again, we have dissolved oxygen on the y-axis, and then we have daytime, right? Dawn, dusk, dawn here. So we see really, really low DO when you have vegetation in water right at dawn. And then we see it increase throughout the day, and then it decreases again at night. So if we were in a room, I'd ask one of you what you think's happening to cause this, but I will just tell you, since it's only me talking, that what's happening during the day is photosynthesis, right? So plants and algae are making oxygen. So it tends to increase in these vegetated systems during the day. And at night, you don't have any photosynthesis, so no oxygen's being made, and lots of stuff is respirating. So things are using up oxygen in the water, whether that's just for living or also for decomposition. So then you get a decline at night. And this is just pictures to show you who's doing this, right? Algae makes a lot of oxygen in the water, and so do plants. So the reason this is important is because when you think about this in a sort of nearshore vegetated ecosystem, the only way oxygen can kind of you can put oxygen in the water with photosynthesis, but you can also put oxygen into these systems through the movement of oxygen-rich water out in the main part of the lake into these interiors, right? And if you have a very sparsely vegetated interior, like you do historically with maybe bulrushes and some lily pads, that oxygen-rich water with wave action and wind is going to get in there pretty easily. But when you have this really dense cattail full of live and dead cattail, that oxygen-rich water is not able to get in there, so that oxygen tends to stay a lot lower. So we think cattails are sort of cutting off this movement of water from the open part of the lake into these nearshore vegetated zones. We did see plants growing back. So the other thing we were looking at were plants, and did plants regrow in these places where we cut cattail? Did native plants regrow? And we did see some of that. So you can see here one of our sampling quadrats, and plants are regrowing. And this is Mike here also looking at plants in his quadrat, seeing that there's regrowth of some, especially floating leaf plants. And so we call that passive revegetation, right? Basically, we're not planting seeds here, right? We're not doing anything to encourage plant growth other than removing cattail. So it is beneficial that we're seeing some passive revegetation, or seeds growing right away. We hope to continue seeing that, and we hope to see more of it as years go on. We also sampled fish. I wanted to show this picture to show you that we're using minnow traps to sample fishes, because it's really hard to sample fish in a really dense cattail stand, but minnow traps work pretty well. So we're talking here small fishes mostly. And again, I'm showing you, this is the last graph, I promise. And I wanted to show you average fish abundance. So basically how many fish we're catching per night. And I'm showing you on the y-axis years, right? 2021, 2022. And this is data, these are data from Lake Maud. And you'll see that cattail removed is in orange and the cattail retained is in blue. So in 2021, remember, this is before we cut any cattail. We see kind of the same, there's some variability here, but about the same number of fishes in each of these plots. And that's good, right? We wanted them to be the same. So it's good we're seeing that similarity. We removed cattail in the fall, and we went back and measured fishes again. And what we see is that in the orange, right, where we removed cattail, we're seeing increased fish abundance. And in the blue, where we retained cattail, it's much lower. So we did see more fish in places where we removed cattail. This was not true for all lakes. So this is true for some lakes, but not all lakes. So not like a slam dunk that in every situation, fishes will move in. So we need to dig into those data more, but we are seeing evidence that fish use it a little bit more. So overall, what are the impacts? I just want to sum up here to make sure I'm leaving some time for questions. So overall impacts and what we're hoping to get from this. So we are seeing generally that fishes and plants seem to increase when we remove cattail. We're seeing, passive revegetation, we're seeing more plants growing, and we're seeing that fish do tend to use these places more. Interestingly, we see more minnows in cattail removed plots. If you remember, I showed you pictures of minnows right at the beginning. Minnows are important because they tend to be the species or the group. It's actually a family, right? Family of fish called minnows. And just as an aside here, if you're not a fish person or if you don't know a lot about minnows, a lot of times we call all small fish minnows, but minnows are actually a specific family of fishes that stay small and don't grow big. So when I talk about minnows, I'm talking about that particular group of species of fish that are called minnows. We see more of them when we remove cattail. And if you remember in the beginning, I told you that the way minnows avoid being eaten by other fishes is to school, right? They like to be able to school together. So they like to have space to swim together. They like the protection of vegetation, but they don't tend to live in super densely vegetated habitats. They tend to use the edges or that sort of open bulrush type habitat. This would be in contrast to something like a small bluegill or pumpkin seed, they'll seek that really deep vegetation and they'll live in there. But because minnows are on the edge, they tend to be more available for game fishes. So when people look at diet of things like walleye, they find that that's predominantly minnows. We did see some evidence that there were minnows using cattail removed plots. We almost never see minnows in cattail retained plots. I think it's just too dense. So it's possible that as we remove cattail in some places, we're providing better habitat for minnows and more food for our game fish. Our data suggests that cattail removal is effective, but water level has a huge effect. So we had the great good or misfortune of doing our study when we had one massive drought, right, in Minnesota in 2021 and even into 2022. And remember, I told you that in order for those stems to stay cut, they needed to stay submerged. Well, we had so much water level change that some of the cattail that we cut actually regrew. And I'm showing you a picture here of one of our sites from Voyageurs National Park. So this was far after we cut it. Voyageurs National Park is a partner with us on this project, so they provided a lot of help and did a lot of the cattail cutting for our sites in the park. These two weird things here are stakes and their temperature loggers that we have that were underwater, right? When we installed them, they record temperature, constantly throughout time. So what you can see here, this is a very late fall picture, is these little green stems growing back. Even in the late fall, once those stems are uncovered, those cattails can regrow. So that's a thing that is definitely an issue. And it's not like once you cut cattail, you're done with it, right? There's going to be maintenance every year in order to maintain these managed areas. And lastly, we're working closely with the DNR to help inform the landowner permitting process. So Minnesota DNR is a partner with us on this project. We've developed it in conjunction with them. They are very interested in the data from our project, and they have the difficult task of managing people, right? So we're working with them to think of, to help inform what they ultimately will make in terms of landowner permitting decisions. And I know they get a lot of pressure from landowners about cattail removal generally. Another really important component and mandate of our project is public outreach. So we don't want to, our idea is not just everybody should remove all their cattail, right? The idea is that we need to restore native plant communities for the health of nearshore ecosystems and also fish communities. So a big component of our project, and that falls right within Minnesota Sea Grant's mission as well, is outreach to different communities. So you can see here a picture of me in my nice Sea Grant shirt and Brendan, my graduate student, talking with a group of landowners and the public at Big Marine Lake Park Reserve. We went and caught some fish and things from our minnow traps and showed it, and then we took them into the field to show them our sites. Oops, sorry, I went too fast there. So the second picture is Brendan. You can see here he's pointing at our sites. We had everybody bring all their boats that they could and piled people into boats and took them out and showed them our field sites. So that's something that we think is really important, is to get the message out that it's restoration, not just not focused only on cattail removal, but it's on plant restoration. So in terms of future research with this project, we have a phase 2 that will start in January, which is great. The plan for us is to monitor cattail regrowth and figure out what maintenance is required to sustain openings, so that when people are maybe able to do this or even do this with the permits you can get now, what do you have to do? Can you just run around the edges with like a underwater weed whacker, right? And every spring, and you can maintain these openings. I think that's something that will be important for people to know. We want to study more detail about fish use of cattail openings. How are they using them? Are larger fish using them to come in and feed? So we have some more detailed studies planned for that as well this upcoming summer. We also want to compare our sites to uninvaded sites. So, right now, as I told you, we have cattail retained and cattail removed, but it would be great to know how the cattail removed sites compare to uninvaded sites. So we'll be including some uninvaded cattail sites in our study as well. And this last picture here is of a muskrat lodge. And we're not studying muskrats, but I always think it would be interesting to look at muskrats in conjunction with cattail. So This is a picture from Northern Lake Huron. Every time we opened up a cattail stand, and again, this is a hybrid cattail stand, and muskrats don't care if it's a hybrid cattail or a regular cattail. They would use it. They would build a lodge in it. They loved it. They kept these openings open. So it would be really interesting to look at muskrat maintenance of cattail openings. I know they're doing some of that work in the Great Lakes region, but I think this might be an interesting sort of study for the future. It's not something we'll have time to look at in what we're doing now, but might be something fun for the future. So with that, I'm happy to pause and answer any questions. I've put there the Minnesota Sea Grant website, the MACERC website. I should thank our funders. So our study is funded by the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And we also have received a lot of help from the National Park Service, Voyageurs National Park, and the Minnesota DNR. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Schrank, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating. Appreciate your knowledge and your skill at presentation and your time. Bill, are you with us?
Yes,
All
I
right.
am.
I don't have to ask my question then. So now let's go to the Q&A portion of today's program. It will be hosted by Bill Granges, who had a little mic problem and it's been straightened out. So he's the director of the Itasca County AIS program and a longtime board member with the Itasca Waters. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. And hello, everyone. Sorry about the mic problems. It said I was muted. We're not using the chat function today. So make sure that you submit your questions by putting them in the Q&A section. Now, I'm going to read the questions aloud and they will be answered by Amy. And we will combine some similar questions and we may not get to all your questions. So if that's the case, please feel free to email us after the program. So let's begin. First question from Ed. Are bulrushes the same as cattails? How do they differ?
Good question. No, bulrushes are very different from cattails. They're a totally different species, and bulrushes are a native species in Minnesota, and there's lots of different species of bulrushes. So I am not a plant person, I'm a fish person, so I cannot tell you all the different types of species of bulrush, but they're very separate from cattail. Without that hybrid cattail, what you see growing deep into the water are usually bulrushes. They're very narrow. They have a thin stem. They're a wetland plant, so they reproduce in the similar way that cattail does. You know, it makes its living in the same way. But bulrushes don't grow and take over and make terrestrial what was the aquatic environment. And when they die back, there's not so much leaf litter. You know, you might find the occasional bulrush stem somewhere, but there's just not so much biomass. So they're a very different plant. And really, sometimes when hybrid cattail takes over, it's actually replacing bulrush, and it's not as beneficial of a species as bulrushes are in the ecosystem.
Okay. Next question. Do invasive cattails affect other species such as birds?
They do. Yep, they do affect other species such as birds. There have not been a ton of studies on cattail effects on other species. Birds, there are some birds that do well with cattail. Red-winged blackbirds are an example that do fine, but especially what are called secretive marsh birds. Some of the more rare birds that you might see in a wetland disappear when there's cattail around, mainly because the habitat is so dense, and also cattail tends to reduce the amount of seed-producing plants that birds like to eat. So other plants that birds might eat the seeds of no longer are there, so birds don't stay and feed in those areas.
Got it. Okay, next question. What is the maximum water depth for cattails to grow, and does it vary by species?
That's a good question. I cannot give you a hard and fast depth. They will grow they certainly grow out to 3 to 4 feet in depth, and it does vary by species. So hybrid cattail can grow both deeper in deeper water than our native cattail. So our native cattail doesn't tend to grow out into the water deeply. I can't give you a maximum depth. I actually don't know that, and I'm not sure if those data are around, but our cattail tends to stay really on the edge. The hybrid cattail grows way out into deep water, like bulrush does, and that's different than our native cattail.
I see. Well, do you think invasive cattails will cause our native broadleaf cattails to disappear?
It's possible. I think there's some speculation about that because of, and that's from some folks who do genetics work on cattail. If you always have, whenever you have our native cattail and a hybrid cattail or a narrowleaf cattail in the same place, they'll reproduce together. So, and because hybrid cattail is more successful, the thought is that eventually it could drive our native cattail to extinction, but I don't think anybody has evidence of that quite yet or a really good handle on how that can happen. It would take a lot more observation of these different habitat patches of native cattail to see what happens to it.
Yeah, I see. All right. Next question from Doug. Do hybrid cattails have benefits to wildlife and shoreline property owners?
They could in certain situations, especially if you don't have any other plants there, right? So one of the reasons to caution against removing cattail just for the sake of removing cattail is if other plants aren't there, you'll have problems with shoreline erosion, right? You do need plants on your shoreline for shoreline erosion. The other potential benefit of cattail or any plant that you have at the edge of your shore, right, is that it will collect anything like fertilizer or runoff or nutrients that is running from land into water. So cattail will still be a benefit in soaking up nutrients and preventing those from getting into your lake. You don't, we put so many nutrients into our lake. Any way we can reduce that is good.
Sure.
And certainly hybrid cattail does that as well.
Okay. Next question. I'm just going to read it the way it's written.
Okay.
In infested waters, does Eurasian water milfoil or curlyleaf pondweed invade? Does the effort replace one invasive with another?
Can you just read that to me again? I think the person might be asking if you could read it again, that would be great.
Okay. In infested waters, does Eurasian water milfoil or curlyleaf pondweed invade? I guess is it going to get in there when there's cattails?
Yeah.
And does the effort replace one invasive with another?
So I think this person might be asking, if we're opening up this habitat, are we like allowing more invasive species perhaps to get in there? We don't have any evidence of that, but that's something we should certainly, keep track of. And as we want to monitor these sites, we will certainly keep track of, are we seeing invasive species in there, or are we seeing native plant species? So that's definitely a good point.
Well, nature hates a vacuum, and that's always a concern with us here in our AIS program is when people go and clear an invasive plant, what's going to replace it?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why monitoring is really important.
Sure. Okay, next question. It sounds like a good idea for lakeshore owners to remove some cattails by cutting. How do we apply to the DNR and how much can we do?
So the current permit, and again, I should reiterate that I am not the DNR, right? So the current permit that I know of, and we applied for these permits to do our research as well. You can get aquatic plant management permit. You can do that online through the Minnesota DNR website. It's actually very easy. They're very responsive. And the current regulation, and there's other rules that would apply, right, depending on where you're asking. But what you do is you fill out the form online. It costs, I think, $35, but I'm not totally sure if that's correct. And I don't know if that varies by location. They will actually come out and look at where you want to remove. And if there are issues, they may say yes or no. But you can apply directly on the website, and aquatic plant management folks are, super willing and responsive and eager to come talk to you about it. So right now, as far as I know, it's a 15-foot wide swath from shoreline to open water. And when we did our cattail removals, they were double that. So we increased the width by 15 meters. So our cattail experiments were, I'm sorry, not 15 meters, 15 feet, but ours were 10 meters wide, so about 30 feet wide from shoreline to open water.
Okay. Next question. Does how old a cattail stand is make a difference to how easy it might be managed?
Yes. So, and this is something we're figuring out more as we go. So one of the things I didn't talk about, but is important to consider, is whether or not you have rooted cattail or floating cattail. So
Mhm.
many of you might be familiar with like these floating cattail bogs that break off and float around lakes, and they can be really a big problem and a hazard to navigation and all kinds of things. What it seems to be happening is as cattail stands get older, there's a tendency, especially when we vary water level like we always do, for them to sort of lift off, and then when you have a flood or you have a strong increase in water level, they tend to break off and start to float around. So if you can catch cattail stands early and manage them earlier, it seems to be less of a problem and less likely for them to be floating. But again, it's sort of, we don't have a lot of hard and fast data for that. It's mostly what we've noticed as, especially when we've had these droughts. And of course, in Rainy Lake, we had just tons of flooding, and that caused a lot of the cattail to lift off. So I think age makes a big difference, and the earlier you can get to a cattail stand, the better.
Sure. Well, invasive species, we're always saying early detection, rapid response. So it makes
Totally.
complete sense.
Yep.
Okay. Next question. How might invasive cattails affect fishing in my lake?
Yeah, good question. And this is what we're trying to find out, right? So I think if cattail are displacing or removing potential fish habitat for things like minnows or baby fishes, right? I think eventually that is going to reduce fish populations. We do not have, this is sort of what our study is designed to find out. You know, is it when we remove cattail, do we see increased use of these openings? And can we then infer that when you have a lot of cattail, you're actually reducing available habitat for fishes? And of course, those fish are going to move elsewhere, but eventually you're just reducing the overall available habitat for fish communities, which can have the potential of reducing fish populations in your lake. I think making those calculations are a little bit further down the road, but right here, we're at the first step of, okay, well, if we're seeing an increased use of these removed areas or comparing uninvaded areas to cattail areas and seeing more fish there, we can infer that, in fact, cattail, when you have a lot of cattail, you have reduced habitat for fish, and that eventually leads to reduced abundance.
Makes sense. Next question we have here. What are some practical things that people can do to help prevent the spread of hybrid cattails?
Yeah, spreading hybrid cattails is interesting. I would say the one place where you can still, as far as I know, spread them is if you use them on your boat for any reason. So transporting them around is not a great idea. They are not a prohibited invasive species according to DNR. So they don't have any restrictions for movement, but the best thing you can do is not move them around. They, of course, reproduce by wind dispersed seeds. So you're going to have, that makes it very easy for them to move from place to place. It's also one of the difficult consequences of those floating bogs, right? Is if you have cattail just floating around your lake, they can stop on shore and become rooted again. So I don't think the mechanism is necessarily humans moving them around at this point. It's trying to manage where we have them, and try to catch them early if you notice them.
Very good. Now next question, I'm not sure we've already answered this or not, but will muskrats use invasive cattails in the same way they use other plants to eat and build their lodges?
They do, yeah, and that was sort of I ended with that. They do that, and interestingly too, indigenous people also can use hybrid cattail in the same way that they use native cattail. So in terms of a plant, right, and its benefits in terms of food and maybe even culture, it's similar. Muskrats don't care if it's still food and it still works to build a lodge. So for them, it's useful for sure.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we have for questions here. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Brian now. So Brian, let's go back to you.
All right, Bill, thank you very much. And a huge thank you to Dr. Amy Schrank for that great information. And if you'd like to watch the program again or recommend it to your friends and neighbors, a recording of today's talk will soon be on our website at tascawaters.org. We would love to get your feedback, so click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program. Or, hold on just a second. Or you will be getting an email evaluation form from Itasca Waters, so you can choose how you'd like to respond. We would really appreciate hearing from you. Our next program will be on July 6th, And our speaker will be Tricia Robinson, Epidemiology Supervisor of the Waterborne Disease Unit, Minnesota Department of Health. She'll be talking about waterborne disease and symptoms, and can swimming make us sick? So that's it for today. I'm Brian Whittemore for Itasca Waters, and thanks for being with us today.